and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. So in a recent video, I talked about how the wild Mustangs and Burros we see here in the United States are technically feral populations that are legally protected for their historical and cultural value, or at least that's the primary reason for their protection. Well, today, we're going to take a look at a study that was recently published and came to my attention actually right before that video was released. And this study is exciting because it suggests that these naturalized feral populations may actually be benefiting these environments that they exist in, at least in the United States in some way. So let's get into this. Before we dive into the study that we're going to be looking at today, I do want to go over one piece of vocabulary. You'll hear me using the word megafauna a lot, and megafauna basically just refers to large animals. And in this case, it's specifically referring to large herbivores. So animals like horses, burros, that sort of thing. All right, so let's look at some background. Now, this study is specifically looking at arid regions, and in arid regions, water is very scarce. And because it's very scarce, it's the main limiting factor for most plants and animals in these regions. And a limiting factor is basically just the thing that makes life hard. The availability of this one thing is going to be what limits the population size. So if it's water, water availability limits how many things can be alive. So it just makes it very tough for both plants and animals if they have very little water available. One way megafauna get around this limiting factor of water availability is by digging wells to obtain water. And this has been documented in both Africa and Asia. If we take a look at this image here, we can see an elephant, Loxodonta africana, so the African elephant digging a well to obtain water in Africa, and a wild donkey of the species Equids hemionus. I apologize for any mispronunciation of the Latin names. Very bad at it. But this donkey species is from Asia. So these are two instances where we see megafauna digging wells to get water in arid regions. And the true scope of this behavior and the full impact of megafauna on their environment in general is actually quite understudied. And while we do know that they dig wells to get water, it's just been kind of a thing that we know and not something that a whole lot of work has been put into. But in 2014, this well digging behavior was actually observed in feral horses and donkeys in North America by Erik Lundgren, who is a field ecologist from the Aarhus University in Denmark. Really sorry about the bad pronunciation of that. I guarantee I messed that up, but doing my best. And so in these images here, we can see the examples of horses and donkeys in the Sonoran Desert in North America digging wells, much like wild counterparts we saw previously with the wild donkey and the African elephant. So that brings us to the study. Now, all elephant species and most equids being horses, donkeys, and zebras, are known to dig wells in their arid ecosystems. It has been observed, hasn't been studied a whole lot, as we've mentioned. And this study that we're looking at that has been recently published, all the links are down in the description below if you want to go look it up. It's very fascinating. It focused pretty much exclusively on the feral populations of horses, so Equus ferus cabalis, and the donkeys, Equus africanus asinus, in the Sonoran Desert, which is in North America and the United States. And while this study did look at this, the full impacts are not entirely understood. So please keep that in mind even when we get to the conclusions here. Now, the main question that they wanted to answer was, do these wells impact other species as well as these equids that are digging them? So the method that they use to observe and study this is basically they set up cameras, they observed what the cameras saw, they entered some data, and produced some lovely graphs and came to some conclusions. Again, keep in mind that this is technically an exploratory study, so this is kind of laying the groundwork for any future study into this. So what did they find? Well, they found that these equid-dug wells increased the water feature density and decreased the water feature isolation. I know those are a lot of big words strung together. So water feature density is just basically how many water features are in X amount of space. So more wells, more water feature density. And then water feature isolation is basically how far apart sources of water are. More wells, the water features are less isolated. And you can see that in these graphs right here. And to put it in simple terms, there's more available water closer together when you have these equid-dug wells present. And the other big thing that they saw was that native species were using these equid-dug wells to get water. And you can see that in this image here. There are different animal species using the wells and drinking from them. You notice in this image, there are some more graphs available as well. So let's talk about that. So one of these graphs shows the species richness, which is basically how many species are there. And it's specifically the species richness using these areas that they were looking at. And the areas that they were looking at were at the background water sources, so the natural water sources, the equid wells, and the dry areas. And you see that the equid wells had a very decent species richness. And then they were also looking at how long different animals stayed there, and of course, the temperature. And you can see at the equid-dug wells, as I said before, decent species richness and decent length of stay. Whereas if you especially look at the dry areas, it's much less. So clearly these wells were being utilized by other animals as well, not just the horses and donkeys. But the other interesting thing that they found was that these wells were kind of becoming these nurseries for native trees to germinate, as you can see in this image. And one of the hypotheses they have for why these trees are doing so well at these wells versus the natural location on the riverbanks is that they didn't have to compete with the herbaceous species that are growing on the riverbanks. So the little seedling trees had more of a shot to grow because they weren't competing with other species for the nutrients and the water available on the banks of the rivers. So their main conclusion, which is going to go along with this figure here, is that megafauna digging wells increases the water available in arid regions. As we can see that, it clearly does, especially when we think back to the graphs we just looked at. And it could possibly act as a buffer in changing environments. So as the climate changes, as areas that didn't used to be so arid start shifting to being more arid, these megafauna digging wells to kind of combat that and get at water for themselves will possibly buffer how fast different places become arid. But again, that's a hypothesis and more work needs to be done. So let's look at this map that I'm showing you right now. So the light beige areas are the current arid regions. And then the darker beige yellowy color is the projected arid environment. So as the climate changes, those environments are thought to become more arid and are very likely to become more arid. And if you notice, they have the types of animals color-coded into peach and blue. Now, the peach colors are the native megafauna that dig wells. So the elephants, the wild donkey species, the antelope we have pictured here. while the blue colors are the feral megafauna, so the equids specifically that dig wells. And you can see clearly this is observed in North America. I mean, the study took place in North America, so obviously it's observed in North America, and you can see it in patches of Africa and Australia as well. So this is pretty exciting. These animals are possibly helping the environment in some way, but there are some controversial implications of the study that we need to discuss. So on the surface, the feral equids in North America seem to be a net positive in these arid regions because they increase the water availability for native species. But we need to remember that our ecosystems here in North America did not evolve with horses and donkeys present. And equids are known to trample vegetation, to erode creek beds, and to outcompete native animals like pronghorn antelope and bison. And the Bureau of Land Management estimates there to be about 95,000 feral horses and burros in the western United States, which is a lot of animals, and the environment can't really support more as of where we are. The current populations are kind of surpassing that critical level, so management is still necessary. And while the study is indicating a benefit to the native species, it's still unknown how necessary that benefit is. Again, this was just an exploratory study that, yeah, the native species are using the wells, it's water available. But is it necessary? We don't know. We may never know for sure if it's necessary or not. And even though this doesn't conclusively say, yes, horses and donkeys are amazing, leave them be, stop trying to control their populations, it does add another factor to consider when we're talking about how to manage those horse and burro populations in the former Wild West. We do need to note that, yeah, they're digging these wells and it is helping native species. That is a big thing to consider, but we also have to not forget the fact that they are still feral, naturalized animals that are not native to the environment and are primarily protected because of their historical and cultural value. So you still need to weigh the pros and cons here, and it's still a delicate balance to maintain these populations, which, again, I am personally in support of maintaining Mustang and burro populations in the United States, but I'm likely biased because I'm an equestrian myself. But there's still that balance that needs to be maintained because the ecosystem can't be left to be destroyed just because we want to maintain these horse and burro populations. So they still need to be managed, they still need to be watched, but the study is very interesting because they're not only damaging the ecosystem, clearly, they're also doing something good, but we just don't understand entirely the span of how much good versus how much destruction they're doing. So it's just another thing to look at, and it's another thing that I thought was very interesting, and horse people and ecologists alike can both be excited about this study. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you. Please leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Does this study excite you? Do you think that this means that we should just cut all human management at all and just leave them be? Are you still in support of management to keep our ecosystem healthy? Let me know. Consider giving me a like, subscribe if you feel so inclined, and I will see you all in the next one.
Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. what you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.